During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States was a place of opportunity. With the massive industrial revolution taking place in the States and the country focusing on urbanization, the technological and economic status of the United States would exponentially increase. The dominant jobs in our society would change from rural areas to urban ones, replacing farmers with factory workers. Many people who moved, including immigrants looking for a better life and others of a lower social class, hoped moving to urban areas would have the opportunity to gain wealth and live successful lives. However, despite the US's mantra of opportunity and freedom, the American dream is not so clear-cut. The hundreds of thousands of people who moved from across the state and across countries soon found themselves trapped in the horrors of factory life, becoming the backbone for another man's American dream. Big industries like coal and steel primarily concerned themselves with profits, leaving their workers in the hands of the machines and strict higher-ups. Before this era, the working man was most likely a farmer, a hard worker but his own. He decided his livelihood and profits as he saw fit, and the only true boss of his products. Working as a farmer was by no means easy. However, the cons of factory work come to outweigh the cons of a farmer. As opposed to modern times where there are regulations and mandatory 40-hour work weeks, companies in that era could make people work as long as they wanted. For a reference, some people worked up to 100 hours a week. Factory jobs in this time were not only monotonous, but incredibly dangerous. Factors like little exposure to light, fumes with a combination of debris in the air, and a dark, cramped atmosphere would be a cesspool for diseases and lead to a plethora of accidents. Numerous cases of limbs being violently ripped off and people getting scorched by machines and scalding debris. One such case represents the brutality of these factories. In plain sight in front of 100 fellow workmen, Martin Schaffel was cut into small pieces at the Philadelphia Carmel Works. He was dragged into the machinery and his head severed. A second later, both legs were cut off. Then one arm after the other fell into the lesser wheels below, both being cut up into many pieces. Before the machinery could be stopped, Schaffel had been literally chopped to pieces. By today's standards, something like that would be horrific, national news. However, these events were commonplace. By 1900, 35,000 workers were killed and 500,000 were maimed and brutalized. An event that put the horrors of working in factories in the limelight was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Over 100 people were killed due to factory regulations not being implemented at the time, and would remain one of the greatest tragedies of all of our nation's history, till over 50 years later. One of the sad parts of being one of the 500,000 who were maimed and brutalized was that the 35,000 who were killed might have been the fortunate ones. Workers who were maimed were terminated with no pension for their accident. As to the higher-ups, the people used in factories were an unlimited resource. Many thousands of people flocked to these cities, grabbing at jobs of the dead. As companies wanted the most profits as possible, factory pay was insufficient. As such, most of the family would end up slaving away in factories to make ends meet. Women often worked similar jobs to men. Long hours in textile factories and piecework shops, and high risk of maiming due to towering machines. Even with all of this, children often had jobs that were worse than their parents. As children, working the machines without error was nearly impossible. With some children starting out as early as 5, accidents and injuries were just as frequent. They were also used to frequently fix machines and to get into tiny places. Smoke from the polluted air would give access to chronic diseases as they were slowly but surely worked to the bone. And even with all their hard work, they were paid 1/100th of what their elders were paid. With all these factors, most didn't make it past 45. With all the civil unrest, workers began striking. Starting in the mid-1800s, unions began forming to combat the foul treatment. Despite the risk of losing jobs, workers would picket and rebel against unfair pay. Starting with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, people placing railroads stopped production, halting further infrastructure till pay was fair. They began rioting, and weren't suppressed until military intervention was involved. Although there was very little in terms of change, this was a clear sign of the beginning of the labor movement. As the numbers of strikes began to rise, leaders of the movement would begin cementing their positions as fighters for rights and freedoms. Peter J. McGuire and Samuel M. Gompers founded the respective unions, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and the AFL, both pushing for fair wages and safe facility, both being key components to the 1938 Fair Labor Standard Act, as they both displayed the ability of making change possible. People like Thomas Hobbes developed concepts like socialism, furthering the ideas of what it meant to live in a society, and others like Upton Sinclair wrote on the terrible conditions of factory work, publicly displaying the mistreatment and downright apathy of higher-ups of these factories. Bringing attention to these conditions brought the movement into the forefront of public issues. However, the public wasn't always too keen on supporting the labor movement. Events such as the Haymarket riots sparked controversy by taking violent actions against military pushback of these riots. Initially, a peaceful protest was organized for 8-hour work weeks and better treatment of workers, turned riot as an unknown, assumed anarchist or communist threw a stick of dynamite, killing 7 and injuring many more. With the display of violence, it was easy to pin the blame on unions, the government citing reasons as to shut down these groups being violence-based. The government had many reasons to shut down unions. However, their biggest reason was money. Parallel to big businesses, the government was driven by monetary gain. Many company CEOs held positions of power, giving them opportunities to sway decisions on change. Despite this fact, unions and workers began steadily pushing for their rights. Moving into the progressive era, unions' efforts began to pay off as many labor laws that were stunted in progression began to move. Workdays were finally limited. First in Muller v. Oregon, workdays decreased to 10 hours for women. Eventually, with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, a maximum work week of 44 hours, banned oppressive child labor, and set the minimum hourly wage at 25 cents. Henry Ford, despite alternate intentions, proved to support the union's plight with implementing a 5-day work week, giving Saturdays off. Despite the shirtwaist factory's tragedy, some good came out of the event. Mandatory building inspections became the norm, slowly requiring safer workplaces for workers. Modern benefits such as health, dental, workers' comp began to form in this era and continued to grow as the years progressed. The labor movement fought against big businesses and CEOs' greed. And even today, the movement reflects similar situations in other countries, like China and Saudi Arabia, in terms of conditions in the workplace and the fight against it. The unfair treatment of workers would bring a surge of resistance to represent the unrest and protest. This fight wasn't just against big businesses. It was a fight against the dark side of capitalism. The Industrial Revolution showcases the horrors of unregulated business and how people in power will do whatever they can to stay in power. But what movements like the labor movement clearly show is the ability to find middle ground, to develop the understanding on both sides, and to move away from extremes.
Joe Hill is at their side.